So Kaldheim has just released, and with it comes a lot of sweet new tribal support cards and changeling support cards. So I decided now is actually a great time to do a massive update to my tribal deck list. And I did so in two different ways. The first way is I did a massive update to my tribal primer. Link to that article in the video description below. In it, you'll find everything you need to build your own tribal deck, including all the tribal options that I could find, 2 different sub-archetypes like combat triggers and tap-untap shenanigans that you can focus your deck on, and I threw in some sample budget deck lists as well. But for the accompanying video, I decided to do something a little bit different, and instead of doing like a deck primer, I'm just going to do a deck tour of my own personal version of tribal led by the Dragon. This is my favorite deck out of all the ones that I own. It's always the first deck that I grab when I want to play a game of EDH. And hopefully you're going to enjoy this sort of deck tour format, which is something that I've never done before. So if you do enjoy this sort of deck tour format, I have a bunch of other decks that are just out of frame. I could not get myself, my face, and all my deck lists in the same shot. So if you do enjoy this sort of deck tour format, let me know in the comment section below, and I might cover some of my other decks. Who knows? I got Perforos, I got Toshiro, I got my Chandra Super Friends, you know, they're all ready to go, just out of frame, just waiting for a deck tour. So without further ado, let's jump into the deck tour. Hey friends, and welcome to a deck tour of my tribal deck list. This is my personal favorite deck out of all the decks that I own, and is the deck that I most often grab when I'm playing EDH with friends. The concept behind tribal is that instead of picking a single tribe and building your deck around that one tribe, tribal builds a deck around all tribes at once, letting you mix and match tribal support cards to suit your individual tastes. Not only does this make tribal one of the most open-ended, modular, and flexible decks you'll ever come across, it also gives a home to all those cool tribal support cards that are stuck collecting dust in small ignored tribes that otherwise would never see any play in EDH. Now, tribal can be broken down into 2 main components, which I like to say is kind of like peanut butter and jelly. The first part, the peanut buttery base, is all the changelings in the deck. Creatures that are every creature type at all times. These provide a creamy, rich base of endless possibilities for us to build upon. And then on top of our changelings, we add our tribal support cards, which are kind of like the jelly of the deck. They add the sweet stuff to the deck. So for example, we can add a dragon tribal support card, and since our changelings are dragons, they benefit from those dragon support cards. Same thing if we have a dwarf tribal support card, our changeling are dwarves, so they get the benefit out of those. Same thing with druids and every sort of tribal card you can think of. Now, when I initially built the deck, it was actually helmed under Morophon the Boundless, and this card is still one of the best cards that I have, but now it's in the 99. Morophon the Boundless is a 7 mana 6/6 legendary changeling, so obviously right there, it's one of the most flavorful options to have a changeling commander. And it comes with a very powerful ability. When it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type, and spells of the chosen type you cast cost Wooburg less to cast. And other creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1. So basically, this is an enormous mana discount for your changeling deck. Since your changelings are all creature types at all times, it doesn't really matter what creature type you choose, they're all going to benefit from this Wooburg cost reduction. But you also have tribal support cards, such as dragons or whatever, and depending on what you have in your hand, you choose whatever creature type you have you get the most ramp out of from your hand at the time, and you get to cast those for significantly less mana, on top of all your changelings costing a lot less mana as well. So not only is Morophon a fantastic ramp source, but we'll get to this later, but it also enables a bunch of very sweet combos in the deck that can just instantly win the game for you. So Morophon's a great card, but I found that in the command zone it was kind of lacking, or at least I didn't get maximum value out of Morophon in the command zone. And the main reason for that was that it costs 7 mana, so odds are Morophon was only cast mid to late game, and if it died, it was very difficult for me to actually recast Morophon more than one time, and any time like that, it felt like I did not want to be doing that very often, and I would more often want to have it actually go to the graveyard so I can reanimate it later for a lot cheaper. So I ended up putting Morophon in the 99, and I've been much happier with it there, despite it being one of the most important cards in the entire deck. And I replaced Morophon with the Dragon. Now, the Dragon is even more expensive casting cost-wise than Morophon. This is a 9-mana, 5-color dragon avatar that's a 10/10 with flying, and it has a powerful triggered ability that says whenever one or more dragons you control attack, draw that many cards, then you may put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. So since our changelings are all dragons, if we attack with a bunch of them, we're going to be drawing a bunch of cards and then putting a permanent from our hand onto the battlefield. Now that effect's really strong, but it's almost irrelevant to this deck because the main draw of having the Dragon in the command zone is actually its powerful Eminence ability, which says as long as the Dragon is in the command zone or on the battlefield, other dragon spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So basically, as long as the Dragon is either in our command zone or on the battlefield, all our changelings are going to cost 1 generic mana less to cast. So it's an insane ramp engine for our deck, much like Morophon was. But the main difference here is that the Dragon never needs to be cast. We can literally just keep the Dragon in our command zone the entirety of the game and get max value out of it, or near max value out of it. And not only is this Eminence ability really good as a ramp source, but as I'll cover a little bit later, pairing it with Morophon's also mana discount, you can actually go infinite very easily with both these two on the battlefield, or rather, the Dragon on the battlefield or in the command zone, and Morophon on the battlefield. So that's why I have Dragon now as the commander instead of Morophon. It's just such an insane value engine that you don't even need to cast. But sometimes mid to late game, I will cast it just to get its powerful trigger ability and start smacking fools for 10 damage in the air. So the Dragon is pretty fantastic here. So now that we've covered the commander of our deck, I'm going to go over the peanut buttery base of our deck, the Changelings. We start things off with the next strongest changeling in our deck after Morophon, and that has to be Mirror Entity. Mirror Entity is a 3-mana 1/1 changeling, and again, because it is a dragon, the Dragon does make it cost only 2 mana to cast instead of its regular 3 mana to cast. And it has a very powerful activated ability. It says pay X until end of turn. Creatures you control have base power and toughness XX and gain all creature types. So this ability's power is twofold. First off, it turns all of our creatures into changelings, including our tribal support cards that are not changeling cards, so they can benefit from overlapping synergies. And secondly, if we just have a lot of creatures on the battlefield and we have a lot of mana to sink into this ability, we can turn our creatures into lethal attackers very easily. Most of our changelings are rather small, but turning them all into 10/10s with Mirror Entity means we can usually kill our opponents pretty quickly and efficiently mid to late game. So not only is this a powerful utility card, but it's also a finisher in our deck. Next up, we got a brand new card from Kaldheim, and this is Realm Walker. This is another changeling that says, as Realm Walker enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. You may look at the top card of your library anytime, and you may cast creature spells of the chosen type from the top of your library. So again, we have a bunch of tribal lord cards that are various creature types, so we choose the one that we have the most in our library that we can possibly play off the top of our library with Realm Walker. For example, slivers or dragons or knights, for example. Those I have multiples of in the deck. But most importantly, all our changelings are whatever chosen type we choose with Realm Walker, so at the very least, we can play all our changelings off the top of our library with Realm Walker. And since we have about 24 changelings in the deck, that's a lot of free value out of a card that we're playing primarily just because it's a changeling. So it's a changeling which benefits a bunch of tribal synergies in our deck, and it generates a bunch of card advantage in our deck as well. Next up, we have another new card from Kaldheim, and that's Mast Vandal. Mast Vandal is just a common. It's 1 and a green, so again, with Eminence, it just costs 1 green. And when it enters the battlefield, you may exile a card from your graveyard. If you do, exile target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. So this is a very efficient removal spell on a Changeling that is already very cheap and we want to play anyway. If Mast Vandal didn't even have an enter the battlefield ability, I would still run it. But mid to late game, when we have a creature that we don't mind exiling in the graveyard, it can also double as a removal, removing a problematic enchantment or artifact from our opponents. So Mast Vandal is doubly good. It's not only just a good Changeling in general, but its triggered ability is just fantastic here as well. Next, we have Unsettled Mariner, and this is a Changeling that says, whenever you or a permanent you control becomes the target of a spell or an ability an opponent controls, counter that spell or ability unless its controller pays 1. So this doesn't look like much, but I have to tell you that this has been a lifesaver many, many times. I've run into many situations where our opponents want to remove an important card on my battlefield, but they just don't have that 1 extra mana and always gets them. So the Mariner is low-key really powerful protection that is also just a very cheap Changeling in our deck. And then we have another card that doesn't look like much, but I assure you, definitely overperforms, and this is Amoeboid Changeling. This Changeling has 2 activate abilities. You can tap it to give target creature gains all creature types until end of turn, or you can tap it and target creature loses all creature types until end of turn. The first activated ability is the one that I use a ton. This deck often has multiple different tribal lords on the battlefield, and Amoeboid Changeling can temporarily turn one of them into a Changeling, so they benefit from all the tribal lord effects on the battlefield as well. So this is just layers of synergy. Also, we can sometimes turn our opponent's creatures into Changelings and then use that to our advantage as well, which I will highlight shortly afterwards. Another one with a lot of utility potential is Shapesharer. Again, this only costs 1 mana, just a blue mana in our deck for a 1/1 Changeling, which is already a fantastic rate, and that alone would be a reason to run the card. But it also has a powerful activate ability. You can pay 2 and a blue, and target Shapeshifter becomes a copy of target creature until your next turn. So if your opponent has a powerful creature on the battlefield, it could literally be anything. It could be like a Sun Titan. It could just be a big commander. Literally anything. Shapesharer can just turn into it temporarily or turn any of her Changelings into them temporarily, and we get the value out of them as well. So it doesn't look like much, but it sets up some really insane situations sometimes. All right, next up, we got Valiant Changeling. This has 7 CMC on it, but you're actually just only casting it for double white because it costs 1 less to cast for each creature type among creatures you control. So if you have another Changeling on the battlefield, it immediately costs 5 less because it's all creature types at all times, and then you just pay double white for a Changeling that is 3/3 with double strike. Now this deck is combat focused, so it has a lot of powerful combat triggers from our tribal support cards, and double strike allows you to get double the value out of these combat triggers, so it's really strong here. Next, we got Graveshifter, which is one of the more expensive Changelings in the deck, so it's a little bit weaker in that regard, but it does have a strong utility effect where when it enters the battlefield, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This deck runs a lot of creatures, I think 38 or 40 of them, so chances are by the time you're casting Graveshifter, there's always going to be a creature you want from your graveyard back to your hand, so that's a nice utility as well. And then we got Taurean Mauler, which is kind of just like a classic card here. It's just a classic beatdown that a lot of older decks used to run just as a threat. This is a Changeling that says, whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Taurean Mauler. Since you have 3 opponents, typically in a commander game, and they're all going to be casting a bunch of spells, Taurean Mauler gets really big really fast. And even without any other synergies on the battlefield, Taurean Mauler by itself can do a silly amount of damage and generally needs to be removed by your opponents or else it's just going to start taking people out. So it's always a really fun one. Next we have another one of my favorites, Universal Automaton. This is the cheapest Changeling in the entire deck. It only costs 1 generic mana, which means with the Dragon in our command zone, its Eminence ability allows us to cast it for free. So we could do literally a turn 1 Automaton and cast another Changeling that costs 1 mana as well. So it's just a huge tempo play, and the primary reason for running all these Changelings is for them to have that sweet jelly of tribal support layered on top of them. So a free Changeling is always fantastic. And then we got Changeling Outcast. Our deck is very combat-centric, so this Changeling can't be blocked, which is really powerful in a deck all about combat triggers. So you never have to worry about any potential blockers of this, so that's really great. And then we have some more of the boring Changelings, but again, all these Changelings, their primary purpose is to be cheap, efficient, and be the rich, creamy base to all these tribal support cards. So paying 1 mana for a 2/2 Changeling is a great rate for us. Same thing here, this is 2 mana for a 2/2 flyer, still a great rate. 1 mana for a Changeling that has Regenerate. 1 mana 3/1. This one costs 3 mana to cast for a 2/2, but it actually comes with a Changeling token that enters the battlefield with it, so that makes it worth it. Then we got another 1 mana 1/1 Changeling. Another 1 mana 1/1 Changeling with Fire Breathing. Ooh. And then we got some new spice. So not only do we have Changeling creatures, but we have a couple Changeling instants. These are tribal instant cards that have the Changeling keyword to them, so they count as dragons or whatever for our tribal support cards. So Crib Swap, since it is a dragon, and because the Dragon doesn't specify dragon creature spells, it's just dragon spells, Crib Swap and similar tribal Changeling cards that are instants also have a 1 mana reduction to casting it. So Crib Swap costs 3 mana generally, but with the Eminence, it only costs 2 mana. And this is basically our deck's like Swords to Plowshares. It's an instant that says remove target creature from the game. Its controller puts a 1/1 colorless Shapeshifter token into play. So again, you just super efficient removal. Your opponents get a Changeling that's a 1/1, but it doesn't really matter. It's just really, really good in this deck, and it's very tutorable and everything. There's just so much overlapping synergies. And then we have another card, Blades of Ellis Veil. It doesn't look like much again, but it is a Changeling instant. It's a Changeling tribal instant, and gives up to 2 target creatures get +2/+0 and gain all creature types until end of turn. This card is a key piece in an infinite combo to deal infinite damage, but it also just turns our non-Changeling cards temporarily into Changelings, so they benefit from overlapping synergies as well. Or we can use it offensively to turn our opponent's creatures into Changelings and yoink them, but I'll show you how that happens soon enough. Shields of Ellis Veil, another way to just make all of our creatures into Changelings to get overlapping synergies, or turn all our opponent's creatures into Changelings so we can yoink them later. And again, I'll go over that soon enough. And then we have another new card from Kaldheim. This is the Bears of Litiara, and this is a saga. Its first saga makes a 2/2 Changeling. Its second chapter turns any number of Changelings we control to have a base power and toughness 4/4, which most of our Changelings are 1/1s, so these essentially gives them all +3/+3, which is pretty significant. And then the third chapter says choose up to 1 target creature or planeswalker. Each creature with power 4 or greater you control deals damage equal to its power to that permanent. So this saga does a little bit of everything. It gives us a Changeling for those overlapping tribal synergies. It buffs all our Changelings like a mirror entity would. And the third chapter is just a removal effect that lets us just turn all our Changelings into a way to kill a creature or a planeswalker, which is pretty awesome. And then finally, the best new card out of all of them in Kaldheim. This is Maskwood Nexus. This is a 4 mana artifact that says creatures you control are every creature type. The same is true for creature spells you control and creature cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. It also has an activated ability. You can pay 3 mana to make a Changeling token, but that ability is just a cherry on top. The main thing here is that all of our non-Changeling creatures in our deck are now suddenly Changelings for the purposes of overlapping tribal synergies. And as you'll see really soon, we have a lot of really powerful tribal support cards, and being able to make all of them benefit from each other is absolutely insane. Maskwood Nexus is just a ridiculously good card in this deck. Alright, up until this point, I've just shown you the base of the deck, what the deck is built on. But now we're going to get to the good stuff. And we're going to kick things off with the ramp package of the deck, which is very tribal focused. And we're going to start with another new card from Kaldheim. This is Magda, Brazen Outlaw, and this is like a super pushed dwarf tribal lord, a 2-mana 2/1 with 3 really good abilities. The first one says, other dwarves you control get +1/+0, which is a nice little anthem effect. And then, the second ability starts getting really crazy. Whenever a dwarf you control becomes tapped, create a treasure token. So this is insane ramp in the deck. Or we have a bunch of dwarves. All our changelings are dwarves. They like attacking, so they're going to be making treasure tokens while they're attacking. Then you can sacrifice 5 treasures to search your library for an artifact or dragon card, put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So there are some really powerful artifacts in our deck that we want to be grabbing with Magda's ability here. The first being Maskwood Nexus, but there's going to be one that's even stronger than Nexus most of the time. And there are some dragons in our deck, most notably one that we're going to be grabbing with Magda pretty often, and that's Hellkite Coarser. Hellkite Coarser is a 6-mana, 6/5 flying dragon, which, since it is a dragon, the Ur-Dragon does make it cost only 5 mana to cast instead of 6. And when it enters the battlefield, you may put a commander you own from the command zone onto the battlefield. It gains haste, return it to the command zone at the beginning of the next end step. So this is kind of like a sneak attack effect for your commander. And since our commander costs a whopping 9 mana for a 10/10 flyer with a powerful attack trigger, that is definitely worth it. So Magda can just cheat the Hellkite Coarser into play, which will then cheat our Ur-Dragon into play temporarily to just smack somebody for 10 flying damage and generate cards and put a permanent to play, at least one. And that's really good. It's really strong. So that's already one of the things we can do with Magda, but that's also not even the craziest thing we could do with Magda. I'll get to the crazy stuff a little bit later. The next ramp card we run here is Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator. This is a 3-mana 2/2 flyer Siren Pirate. This is whenever one or more pirates you control deal damage to opponents, you create a treasure token for each opponent dealt damage. So since our changelings are all pirates and we typically have 3 opponents, if we're hitting all 3 of our opponents with at least 1 pirate each, we generate 3 treasure tokens. And if we have double strike, then we can generate even more treasure tokens that way. So this is a pretty insane ramp source in our changeling deck. And then speaking of insane ramp, we got Harabaz Druid, which is a 2-mana 0/1 that taps to add X mana of any one color to your mana pool, where X is the number of allies you control. So it itself is an ally, so it'll at least tap for 1 mana, but since all our changelings are allies, if we have multiple changelings on the battlefield, then Harabaz Druid can start tapping for an absurd amount of mana in this deck. It gets pretty crazy pretty fast. Next, we got Manoeuvred Sliver, and it says Sliver's creatures you control have tap to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So this card taps for mana by itself, but it also turns all our changelings into essentially birds of paradise, where they can all just tap for mana as well. So when we have a bunch of changelings on the battlefield and we want to ramp out some big spells on a turn, Manoeuvred Sliver can definitely do that for us. Next we have Limited All-Star Risen Reef, or I guess also Standard All-Star, I suppose. Whenever Risen Reef or another elemental enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield tapped, and if you don't put the card onto the battlefield, you put it in your hand. So this is both card advantage and ramp rolled up in one, and it's just super efficient. Once you just start slamming down your super cheap, efficient changelings, they're all elementals, you're drawing a bunch of cards and you're ramping at the same time, and it gets pretty out of control very quickly. Next, we got Dragon's Horde, which is an artifact that says whenever a dragon enters the battlefield under your control, put a gold counter on Dragon's Horde. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, or if you don't need the mana, you can also just tap it to remove a gold counter from Dragon's Horde to draw a card. So this is a mana rock that mana fixes in our 5-color deck, does it at a decent rate, but also if we don't need that extra mana, suddenly whenever we're playing our changelings that are dragons, we get to just, tap it and draw cards off it as well. So it's a nice combination of both mana rock and card advantage rolled up in one. This is another card that I absolutely love, Rooftop Storm. This is a 6 mana enchantment that says you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for zombie creature spells you cast. So all our changeling creatures suddenly just cost 0 mana to cast from our hand or from other places like our graveyard, which more on that later. But this is an expensive ramp, but once you have it on the battlefield, you can really go off. You could just chain together a bunch of card draw and just dump out changeling after changeling, and it gets pretty insane. Next, we have a personal, a pet card of mine that I absolutely love, Cursive Opulence. Since our deck is all about combat, Cursive Opulence is an aura that you curse somebody with, so you enchant a player with, and whenever the enchanted player is attacked, you create a gold token, and this gold token says sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Each opponent attacking that player does the same. So not only do we get our own tokens when we attack that cursed player, but when our opponents attack that cursed player as well, and they're going to want to because they want that gold, you also benefit. You also make a gold token each time that happens. So this is very sneaky political ramp that fits really well on the theme of attacking in this deck. We finish off our ramp package with more generic staples. This is a 5-color deck, so mana fixing is really important. So a card like Fellwar Stone is just a staple in it. Same thing, we got Sol Ring. I mean, it makes colorless, so it's a little bit worse than a 5-color deck, but it's still busted. It's like the Power 9 that hasn't been banned in Commander, so might as well run it. And then another instant staple, Arcane Signet. And then finally, Chromatic Lantern. I know not a lot of people love Chromatic Lantern these days, but I really like it. I think it's still really good in a 5-color deck. And not only do I think it's just generally good, but it's really nice for me because I don't want to waste too much thinking time looking at all my lands and trying to figure out how to sequence my spells correctly to make sure that I have the right mana, colored mana for every single spell. I like just having Chromatic Lantern on the battlefield and then suddenly all my lands tap for all colors and I don't need to think about it, and it just makes everything super simple to actually cast all your spells. So not only is it a good card, I think, it's also just a time saver and a stress saver, I would say. All right, next we're going to cover my favorite part of any deck, and that's the card draw aspect. And we're going to start with a pretty spicy one. This is Liliana's Contract. This is a 5-mana enchantment that says when it enters the battlefield, you draw 4 cards and you lose 4 life. And that's already a pretty decent rate. Drawing 4 cards for 5 mana is actually pretty solid, and the losing 4 life part is pretty much negligible. So that's already pretty decent to play. But the main reason why I'm running it, or the ulterior motive for running it, is its other ability that says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 4 or more demons with different names, you win the game. And now, since all our changelings are demons with different names, if we have 4 or more of them on the battlefield, on our upkeep with Contract on the battlefield, and this triggered ability resolves, we just win the game. So that's always just a nice ace up our sleeve. You can play it early and you're just drawing cards and whatever. If it gets removed, it doesn't really matter. But if you play it mid to late, or you just incidentally have 4 changelings on the battlefield really quickly and you put down Contract and your opponents don't have a way to deal with your board, that's a really easy way to win the game, and just a cool way to win the game. I love alternate win conditions, so Liliana's Contract is serious work here. Next up, we got Eureka Tiger Shadow. Now, this is some ninja tribal spice for the deck. It has ninjutsu, And it says, whenever a ninja you control deals combat damage to a player, reveal the top card of your library and put that card into your hand. Each opponent loses life equal to that card's converted mana cost. So not only does it say basically every single time your ninjas or changelings deal combat damage, you draw a card, it's actually way better than that because the Devils is a finisher. If you start revealing high CMC cards off the top of your library, your opponents can die really fast. And we do have, 5 drops, 6 drops in our deck. Morophon is a 7 drop, for example. So if you have a bunch of changelings out and you've triggered Eureka like 5 or so times, that could just spell the end for your opponents. This Eureka puts a serious clock on your opponents while just simultaneously drawing you a ton of cards in the process. It's actually insane. Now, the card draw aspect of Eureka is so good that I do run a lesser version of Eureka, which is just Ingenious Infiltrator. Also a ninja, also ninjutsu, but it says whenever a ninja you control deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. So it basically just does the draw aspect of Eureka without actually killing everybody in the process. So it's weaker than Eureka, but still in this deck, it's all about combat triggers, all about attacking. That alone, you draw a ton of cards off Ingenious Infiltrator, and I think it's definitely still worth running. Then we got the first party card in the deck. This is from Zendikar Rising. Tazri, Beacon of Unity. This is a 5-mana CMC spell that actually only costs 1 white mana to cast consistently in our deck, because it says this spell costs 1 less for each creature in your party. Now, since changelings are every single creature type, they can count as every single party member. So if we have 4 changelings on the battlefield, we suddenly have a full party and we can cast Tazri for just 1 white mana. So a single mana to cast Tazri for this 4/6 creature. And it has a powerful activated ability. You can pay 1 blue, a black, a red, and a green, or generic mana to make it cost more, but you can pay 4 mana to look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal up to 2 cleric, rogue, warrior, wizard, and or ally cards from among them and put them into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library into a random order. So this is essentially card draw for the changeling deck. I calculated the hit rate, and it's about an 86% hit rate of changelings / other creatures that incidentally are cleric, rogue, wizards, or allies or warriors in our deck. So 86% chance that we're going to be getting 2 cards every single time we activate Tazri, which is a very fantastic rate. Tazri is just really good at rebuilding your hand. Then we have my favorite card draw in the deck, I think. Unesh Cryosphinx Sovereign. This is a 6-mana Sphinx 4/4 flyer that says Sphinx spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. So all of our changelings, I don't think we have any other Sphinxes in the deck. All of our changelings, though, are Sphinxes, so they all cost 2 less to cast. That plus the Ur-Dragon means we can cast Morophon, for example, for just 4 mana instead of 7, which is absolutely absurd. And then its triggered ability is absolutely insane as well. Whenever Unesh or another Sphinx enters the battlefield under your control, reveal the top 4 cards of your library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. Put 1 pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So this is basically fact or fiction. Every single time one of your changelings or Unesh enters the battlefield, I've chained off this so many times. It's absolutely fantastic, where you're just playing changeling after changeling after changeling, and your opponents constantly have to feed you a bunch of cards into your hand. And actually putting stuff in our graveyard is kind of beneficial for us too, because we have some really powerful graveyard recursion that I'll get to shortly. But then we're going to go to the last card advantage card in our deck, and that is the first Sliver. This is Wooburg for a 7/7 Sliver that has Cascade, and Sliver spells you cast have Cascade. So again, all our changelings are slivers, and we have some other slivers in the deck as well. They all have Cascade, so not only are we getting card advantage off our library every single time we cast a sliver or a changeling, but they also immediately go into the battlefield instead of our hand, so it's a huge tempo play, ramp, card advantage. I don't know what the proper terminology is there, but it's really sweet. The first sliver is just a really fun card. So that covers the card advantage aspect of our deck. And now I want to go over the recursion aspect of our deck. And that's basically just 1 card, because this card is just so darn good. This is Hakan Stromgald Scourge. And this is a really weird one. This is a 3-mana, 3/3 zombie knight that has a very interesting casting requirement. It says you may cast Hakan from your graveyard, but not from anywhere else. And as long as Hakan is on the battlefield, you may cast knight cards from your graveyard. So this is weird. If Hakan's in your hand, you can't actually cast it. So you need to have Hakan in your graveyard some way. And we have many ways of doing that. And it's a little bit awkward to use properly. You do have to build around Hakan in that sense. But the payoff is really good because as long as Hakan's on the battlefield, and you can cast Hakan repeatedly from our graveyard each time it dies. So as long as Hakan's on the battlefield, we can cast knight cards from our graveyard. And it doesn't say knight creature card. It says just knight cards. So our tribal instants and sorceries also can be cast from the graveyard by Hakan infinite number of times. So we have a bunch of knights in our deck, but we also, again, all our changelings are knights as well. And this actually enables some pretty insane combos. So I did mention Morophon actually enables some pretty insane combos, and this is what I was referring to. So when Hakan's on the battlefield, if Morophon's on the battlefield, that's great. If Morophon's in the graveyard, Hakan can play Morophon from the graveyard and have Morophon on the battlefield. When Morophon's on the battlefield, we choose literally any creature type. It really doesn't matter. So Morophon's making spells of a chosen creature type Wooburg less. The Dragon is making all of our dragon spells cost 1 less. And that allows us to cast Blades of Ellis for free. Between Morophon lowering the cost of it by 1 red and Dragon lowering the cost by 1 generic, Blades of Ellis is now free to cast because it is both a dragon and whatever chosen type of Morophon, and it's also a knight. So we can cast Blades of Ellis for free. Hakan lets us cast it from our graveyard because it's a knight, so we can cast Blades of Ellis infinite number of times for free, making all of our creatures infinitely large in power, which is absolutely insane. So basically, if we have any unblocked attacker attacking an opponent, we can just make them one-shot. They're just dead. They're just gone. So that's really insane. That is a really powerful and easy to assemble finisher in our deck because Morophon is a knight, Blades of Ellis is a knight. We can cast them from our graveyard at any time. And setting it up is pretty easy too. So the only trick is to get Hakan into our graveyard consistently, to actually consistently make use of Hakan. And that's where our tutors come into play. Our tutors are chosen not just to add consistency to our deck, but also double up as ways of getting Hakan into our graveyard consistently, so we can use this really powerful graveyard recursion. So we have a couple options. The first option is Entomb. This is just a classic, pay 1 black mana to search our library for any card, put that card into the graveyard, and shuffle our library. This is almost always Hakan, but if Hakan's already in our graveyard and we need our combo pieces, we can Entomb for that instead. Same thing with Gerard's Orders. This is 4 mana to search your library for up to 2 creature cards and reveal them. Put one into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So usually we just get whatever utility creature we want into our hand, and we put Hakan directly into the graveyard. Then we got Buried Alive, another classic. We search our library for up to 3 creature cards and put them into our graveyard, Hakan usually being one of them, and then a Knight and Morophon being another one of them. And then we got a new one from Zendikar Rising, or relatively new. This is a party sorcery. This is Coveted Prize, and it's also really sweet. This is a 5 mana sorcery that costs 1 less to cast for each creature in your party. So again, if you have 4 changelings on the battlefield, you've already accomplished the party roll where you're casting it for just 1 black mana. And it says search your library for a card, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. If you have a full party, so all 4 changelings or whatever, you may cast a spell with converted mana cost 4 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost, which is really, really solid. Really, really solid. So it's basically 1 black mana, put a card into your hand. It's like a 1 black mana demonic tutor that you immediately also get to cast a spell from your hand for free, which in our deck is absolutely insane. We also have another way to get Hakan onto the battlefield, but also it's just a super flexible tutor, and it's War Gates. Wargate is Bant. It's green, white, and blue, and X. And you can search your library for a permanent. You can search your library for a permanent card with converted mana cost X or less. Put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. This is a way to actually put Hakan onto the battlefield without putting it in the graveyard first, because you're not casting it, you're just putting it onto the battlefield, so it gets around the Hakan restriction. But it's also super flexible. It can get any permanent. You can even pay it for 3 mana and X equals 0, and you can get a land because it's a 0 CMC permanent. So that's always really fun. Just super flexible. One of my favorite tutors in the entire game. Just an easy inclusion in this deck as well. Then we have another super spicy tutor, and that is Sliver Overlord. Sliver Overlord is a Wooburg Sliver Mutant 7/7, and it has 2 powerful abilities. The first one says, search your library for a Sliver card, reveal that card, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. So it grabs any of the sweet Changelings in our deck, any of the sweet Slivers in our deck, and you could just do it repeatedly. It's very good. That's already good enough in the deck. But it also has a second ability that is deceptively powerful, and it says gain control of target Sliver. And if you recall, I went over some cards in the past earlier in this video that kind of changed the creature type of opponent's creatures, turning them into Changelings. So we have actually various ways in our deck to turn our opponent's creatures into Slivers. Cards like Shields of Vel's Veil, where we can turn all creatures target player controls into Changelings. So if we target our opponent's stuff with Shields of Vel's Veil, suddenly they're Slivers, and Sliver Overlord can actually yoink them, which is absolutely fun. It's mean, but it's totally fun. So that's another great one. Then for more tutoring action, we got Bring to Light. This is a 5 mana sorcery with Converge. And it says, search your library for a creature, instant, or sorcery card with convert mana cost less than or equal to the number of color of mana spent to cast Bring to Light. Exile that card, then shuffle your library. You may cast it without paying its mana cost. So you can basically, in a 5-color deck, you can just pay Wooburg, and then you get a creature, instant, or sorcery card from your library and put it directly into play. So just super efficient tutoring. Then we got a very weird card that I don't think a lot of people will see outside of Tribal, and that's Caterin Summons. This is 1 black mana for a sorcery that says, search your library for a mercenary card, reveal that card, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. This is basically a half-mana demonic tutor in our deck, because it can get any Changeling from our deck, because they're all mercenary cards. So that's pretty awesome. And then finally, we got one more tutor in the deck, and that's Higger the Still Wind. This is a 5-mana human ninja with ninjutsu 4, and it says whenever Higger the Still Wind deals combat damage to a player, you may search your library for a ninja card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. If you do, shuffle your library, and you can pay 2 mana to give target ninja creature unblockable until end of turn. So again, we have a bunch of Changelings in our deck, but we also have some powerful ninjas in our deck, like Eureka, that Higger can actually tutor up, and it's repeatable. And it also gives evasion to our Changelings, which is another great way to make sure that our combat triggers are super consistent. So those are the tutors in the deck, and now we're going to go over the removal spells in our deck. And our deck has some very sweet interaction. And this is my favorite removal spell in the entire deck. This is Peer Pressure. A card probably you've never seen outside of Tribal. This is a 4-mana sorcery that says choose a creature type. If you control more creatures of that type than any other player, you gain control of all creatures of that type. So let's say your opponents have a wizard or 2 on the battlefield and you want to yoink them. Well, if you have 3 or more Changelings on the battlefield, then you have the most wizards on the battlefield. You can choose wizard with Peer Pressure, and you just steal all the wizards with Peer Pressure. It's a very flexible creature theft effect that usually will steal 1 or more creatures each time it's cast very consistently. It can lead to enormous blowouts, but even just stealing 1 or 2 creatures with Peer Pressure is insanely valuable. It's my favorite removal spell in the entire deck, and it's always the one that people have to like stop and actually read to figure out what the heck it's doing. So I always love playing Peer Pressure. It's a ton of fun. Next, though, we have probably the strongest removal spell in the entire deck, and this is the Reaper King. This is a 10 CMC spell because it has a hybrid cost of you're either paying 2 or a colored mana of Wooburg, but generally speaking in our deck we can really reliably cast it for just 5 mana, Wooburg, and it's a 6/6 legendary Scarecrow that says other Scarecrow creatures you control get +1/+1, and whenever another Scarecrow enters the battlefield under your control, destroy target permanent. Now, there aren't any other Scarecrows in the deck, there are only Changelings in the deck, but I mean, most of our Changelings are really cheap, and we have a whole ton of them, so the moment Reaper King is on the battlefield, generally speaking, that same turn, we're going to be dropping 1, 2, maybe 3 Changelings on the battlefield, perhaps even more, and we're just blowing up any problematic permanent. With Reaper King on the battlefield, if we do chain a bunch of Changelings, one after the other, we could just take out all of our opponent's boards. And this is definitely not only a good way to remove basically anything, it's highly flexible because it can hit any permanent, but it could just win the game if it's not answered very quickly. Like, we could just play a bunch of Changelings, and eventually all of our opponent's boards are just going to be gone. So it's definitely our best removal spell, but also just a finisher, because if our opponents have no permanents on the battlefield, we just win by default, really. So it's very powerful. Definitely going to make you the arch enemy once you show it, though. But if your opponents don't have a response, you just win the game. And then we have the only cat lord in the deck. It's Feline Sovereign. This is a 3-mana 2/3 cat that says other cats you control get +1/+1 and have protection from dogs. And also has whenever one or more cats you control deal combat damage to a player, destroy up to one target artifact or enchantment that player controls. So if we attack one opponent and deal combat damage to them with a Changeling, which is a cat, we get to destroy up to one target artifact or enchantment that player controls. But for each opponent, we can destroy up to one of their things. So you can get in a 3-player, if you have 3 opponents, you can blow up 3 things per combat phase with Feline Sovereign, so it's pretty good. And in a roundabout way, not only does it give a little boost to your Changelings, giving them +1/+1, but protection from dogs actually randomly does become relevant sometimes if we have ways to turn our opponent's creatures into dogs. And again, I'm going to be bringing this card up a bunch, but Shields of Ellis Vale does it, and a couple other cards that can change our opponent's creatures into Changelings does it as well. So it is pseudo-evasion in a way if we have the right pairing for it, but it's an Anthem, it's repeatable removal, it's just good stuff for 3 mana. Then we have another new card from Kaldheim. You can see there's a trend here. There's a reason why I did this video after Kaldheim was released. But here's another tribal board wipe with Battle of Frost and Fire. This is a 5-mana saga. The first chapter, when it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to each non-giant creature and each planeswalker. So 4 damage isn't going to kill all creatures at all times, but it's going to kill most non-giant creatures. And since our Changelings are all giants, they're not going to be affected. And it also kills planeswalkers too, which is not irrelevant as we keep seeing more and more planeswalkers being printed. The second and third chapters aren't as important. It's mostly that enter the battlefield first trigger that we really like, but the second chapter is nice gravy. It's scry 3, and then the third chapter is actually quite strong. It says whenever you cast a spell with converted mana cost 5 or greater this turn, draw 2 cards, then discard a card. So this is one way to actually discard a con if it's stuck in our hand, and while most of our spells are under 5 converted mana cost, we do have a fair number of them that are 5 or greater, so they could these 2 last chapters can get some good value, but we're really playing it for just the first chapter, and the rest is just a cherry on top. And then the final last removal spell in the deck is Crux of Fate. This is just a classic budget removal board wipe that is noticeably a lot better in our deck. It's 5 mana, and you choose one, destroy all dragon creatures, or destroy all non-dragon creatures. So generally speaking, we choose the latter. We destroy non-dragon creatures with it because all our changelings are dragons, and it's an asymmetrical board wipe in that way. And that's really good value for 5 mana. It's very easy to get rid of even the scariest things on the battlefield by choosing non-dragons that way. I do want to replace this card with Widespread Brutality, which is just a card at the time of recording this I totally forgot existed. And I might have it pop up on the screen right now if I remember during editing phase. But it's really good, and it's more conditional than Crux of Fate, but it is 1 mana cheaper, and it's just really unique. You never see it anywhere else, so it looks really cool. And that's kind of the point of Tribal is to play a bunch of cool, unique cards, not necessarily staples. A few cards on the deck are made to enhance our creatures. The first one being Cloud Shredder Sliver. It just gives slivers we control flying and haste, so all our changelings have flying and haste. Then we got Night Exemplar. Night Exemplar has First Strike, and it gives other night creatures we control +1/+1 and indestructible. And since it's a night, we can actually cast it from our graveyard with a con. Then we got another knight, Sylvia Bright Spear. It has double strike, and dragons your team control have double strike. Double strike for changelings mean double the combat triggers, so double the card draw and life loss off Eureka, and double the stuff we're blowing up with Feline Sovereign, and double the treasure tokens we're making with Malcolm. And then finally, my favorite little combat trick has to be Notorious Throng. This is a 4 mana tribal sorcery rogue, but we're more often casting it for its prowl cost of 6 mana, which says you may play this for its prowl cost if you dealt combat damage to a player this turn with a rogue, so any of her changelings. So what it does is it puts X 1/1 Black Fairy rogue creature tokens with flying into play, where X is the damage dealt to your opponents this turn, and if its prowl cost is paid, you take an extra turn after this one. So for 6 mana, you take an extra turn, and you put a bunch of flying tokens onto the battlefield for even more damage on that extra turn. It's definitely one of my favorite ways to push in lethal damage over the course of 2 turns. And then the last aspect of the deck is just the lands, and you would think the lands are boring, but nope, Tribal has some really cool lands as well. And we're going to start with the coolest one, obviously. Another brand new card from Kaldheim. This is the World Tree. The World Tree enters the battlefield tapped, and it only taps for green mana by itself, which is kind of a little bit of a drawback in a 5-color deck. You generally don't want your lands entering the battlefield tapped. You want them untapped so you can immediately use them, and tapping for just 1 colored mana. In a deck that's 5 color, it kind of sucks early on, at least in the first couple turns. But as long as you have 6 or more lands, this card gets absolutely insane. As long as you have 6 or more lands you control now tap for any colored mana, so it's the ultimate mana fixing. Like I said with Chromatic Lantern, I really enjoy ultimate mana fixing, so I don't have to think about what colors are tapping for what and sequencing my spells properly. So this is like the ultimate mana fixing as soon as you have 6 more lands on the battlefield. And not that would actually be good enough by itself. I would actually run the World Tree just for its amazing mana fixing ability, basically a Chromatic Lantern on a land form that you don't even have to pay mana for. The only drawback is it comes with a play tap. That's really it when you have 6 or more lands. But it actually comes with a very relevant secondary ability. You can pay double Wooburg, so 10 mana, 2 mana of each color, and tap the World Tree, sacrificing it to search your library for any number of god cards, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So again, all our changelings are gods, just inherently. So putting all our changelings in our library onto the battlefield is a very quick way to have an instant army that can usually win you the game. It's quite strong, but it also pairs really well with another card that I covered a little bit earlier, and that's obviously Maskwood Nexus. When Maskwood Nexus is on the board, all our creatures on the battlefield, in our hand, in our library, are gods. They're every single creature type. So if Maskwood Nexus on the battlefield and we crack the World Tree with Maskwood Nexus on the battlefield, we just put all
our creatures from our library onto the battlefield. And of course, since we have Cloud Shredder Sliver giving all slivers we control haste, that's just an instant win. We just put all our creatures onto the battlefield. They have haste, they have flying, they can immediately attack, and we just win the game that way. So the World Tree is actually not just an amazing mana fixer, which is its primary role, but it's also a great finisher as well, and a very flavorful, really splashy one that just I'm really excited to do it. I haven't had a chance to actually win the game off the World Tree, but I'm really excited to do it. But the fun doesn't end with just the World Tree. We have a bunch of other tribal lands that we get to get a lot of value out of. And the first one is actually the Lorwyn Tribal Reveal Cycle. I don't know if it has a more official sounding name, but basically they're a cycle of lands that are tied to a specific tribe, and they enter the battlefield untapped only if you reveal a creature of the chosen tribe from your hand, or else they enter the battlefield tapped. But they are definitely worth running because they have extra utility attached to them. So the best one out of all of them is Murmuring Bosk. This land actually counts as a forest, so if you have any ways to tutor up specifically forests, like Nature's Lore or 3 Visits, you can actually tutor up Murmuring Bosk, and it will enter the battlefield tapped unless you reveal a Trifo card from your hand, so you just reveal a Changeling. And not only does it tap for a green, but it also taps for white or black, and it will deal 1 damage to you if you tap that way. But basically, it mana fixes for 3 different colors, and it's a forest, and it enters the battlefield untapped if you reveal a Changeling from your hand. And then we got Gilt-Leaf Palace. This is the same thing with revealing an elf card, and it taps for black and green. Then we got Wanderwine Hub. This is blue and white if you reveal a merfolk. Flamekin Village is a little bit different. It doesn't actually mana fix, but if you reveal an elemental from your hand, it taps for red, and you can use it to give your creatures haste. You tap 1 red and you tap Flamekin Village to give target creature haste until end of turn. So if you are ahead on mana, then it's not so irrelevant to play a creature and immediately give it haste, immediately start attacking with it. Then we got Path of Ancestry. This card is just solid. Basically every single time we cast any Changeling, we're going to be scrying. It enters the battlefield tapped. That's the only downside, but it taps for all 5 colors. And every single time we cast a Changeling or a dragon, because their dragon is a dragon, we get to scry. So it's a ton of scrying in it. It's a ton of utility, and it's very much worth the fact that it enters the battlefield tapped. And then we got Swarmyard. This is a colorless land. It doesn't mana fix, which is a relevant risk in a 5-color deck, but the payoff is definitely worth it. You can tap it to regenerate target insect, rat, spider, or squirrel. We don't have any insects, rats, spiders, or squirrels per se, but again, all our Changelings are all those creature types. So just by tapping it, we can regenerate any of our creatures. So if they would die in combat, we just save them. If there's a lot of board wipes or removal spells that say destroy, and Swarmyard can still save them. Doesn't work against like Wrath of God effects and the older board wipes that say like destroy all creatures and they can't be regenerated, which kind of sucks, but basically all the modern cards, all the modern removal spells, it's going to work just fine against. So it's really, really strong. And then we have a Changeling that is a land. Again, this taps are colorless, Mutavault taps are colorless, but you can just pay 1 mana and it becomes a Changeling until end of turn. At 2/2 Changelings, having a Changeling as a land is pretty sweet. And then we have some more generic stuff. Command Tower is always good. Exotic Orchards, always good. No complaints there. Mana Confluence, again, taps are 5. City of Brass also taps for 5. Reflecting Pool almost always taps for 5 as well. And then we have the less interesting mana fixing in the mana base. These lands, we're just running the 10 shock lands, so Breeding Pool, Steam Vents, Hallowed Fountain, Temple Garden, Blood Crypt, Watery Grave, Stomping Ground, Godless Shrine, Overgrown Tomb, Sacred Foundry. Ooh, I missed one of the tribal lands. This is the white-red tribal land from Lorwyn. You have to reveal a giant card from your hand. Also really solid. So after the Shock lands from Ravnica, we have the Triome lands as well. Similarly, they're just good mana fixing. They have 3 basic land types, so you can be fetched out really easily, and we do run a bunch of fetch lands. So we have Inditha Triome, we got Ketria Triome. I also just love the artwork on these. I love these full art lands. They're kind of hard to tell what colors they actually tap for, because they're all just purple crystals or reddish looking crystals. But I still think the artwork is just fantastic, and the full art frame just really works well with it. I love the comic book style. But yeah, so we got Ketria, Zagos Triome, and Rogren Triome. I actually cut out Savai Triome. I'm slowly cutting out the tribes in general for some more flavorful options, but I love the artwork on them, so it's hard to get them cut. And so we have the Shocks, we have the Triomes, and then obviously we have a bunch of fetch lands. And again, nothing too special here. They just work really well, fetching up Shocklands and Triomes. So Wood Foothills, Windswept Heath, Marsh Flats, a nice fancy version of it there. Arid Mesa, fancy version of Scalding Tarn. Bloodstained Mire, Flooded Strands, Polluted Delta, and then finally I have one forest. Just a lowly forest to end the things off. End on an anticlimactic note. I used to have more basics in the deck, but as I slowly traded for a better mana base, the Shocks, the Duels, the Shocks, the Triomes, and the Fetches, I slowly but surely cut out all the basics. So this is a very, very greedy mana base. Blood Moon would wreck me. Ruination would absolutely wreck me. I don't think I would be able to play the game if any of those hit. But I left one forest in the deck for now as a way to kind of respect the Path to Exile. So if somebody paths one of my creatures, I can at least have a chance to go search up a forest and not be completely blown out by it. I also just like the artwork on this one. I love Urza's Saga basics. They're my favorite basics in the entire game. And the artwork is just so weird. It's all mushroomy and amorphous. I don't know. It feels like fitting for a tribal changeling deck where all these weird alien looking shapes converge in a forest. I don't know. I think it's really cool. So that's basically it, friends. We got to the end of the video, and oh boy, was it a long one. But I hope you all enjoyed. This is the first time I've done something like this, and yeah, it was fun. Just me rambling, reminiscing about this sweet deck, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed rambling about it. I could just talk forever about this deck, Tribal. If you are interested in more in-depth guide, if this was not enough for you, and you were interested in more in-depth guide on Tribal as an archetype itself, and all the many different card choices to go into it. Maybe you're looking to build your own version of Tribal. Then again, there's a link to a primer that I wrote, and it was a very exhaustive primer. I spent a lot of time working on it, so check that out in the video description below. And yeah, hope everybody enjoyed. If you do like these sort of deck tour things, perhaps maybe not as long in the next one, I have a lot more decks that I can cover, so I'm keen to see if people actually enjoy this style of deck tech. I assume it's a little bit long, so I'm gonna end here. But thanks so much for watching and reaching the end. So until next time, friends, see ya. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, help us out by clicking the like button down below. And to keep up with the latest and greatest, make sure to click the subscribe button. And if you want to watch similar videos, click on the links appearing on screen right now.